All right, so picture this. You walk your kid to their Louisiana public school classroom, and bam, right
Yep.
there on the wall are the Ten Commandments. Not a suggestion, a requirement, thanks to a new law. We're diving into a federal judge's ruling that just threw this whole thing into a legal whirlwind. And trust me, the implications go way beyond one state.
This case really boils down to a question that's been simmering in the U.S. for ages. Where does the line between religion and public education actually lie?
Yeah, it's like this law ripped the Band-Aid off a pretty sensitive topic.
Mhm.
So Louisiana's HB 71 said every public school, from kindergarten through college, had to prominently display the Ten Commandments by January 2025. The governor signed it back in June, but it immediately hit a wall of lawsuits.
And the group who sued is fascinating in itself. We're not talking a homogenous group. These were parents with kids in Louisiana public schools, but from Jewish, Christian, Unitarian, Universalist, and even non-religious backgrounds. That right there tells you how broadly this law was perceived as overstepping.
Totally. It's like they looked at this law and said, hold up, this is impacting all of us, regardless of what we believe or don't believe. So let's talk about the legal nitty-gritty here. The First Amendment is front and center, right?
Absolutely. But instead of getting bogged down in basic definitions of the establishment and free exercise clauses, let's look at how this Louisiana case echoes a landmark Supreme Court case from 1980, Stone v. Graham. Back then, the court struck down a Kentucky law that was eerily similar, also mandating the Ten Commandments in public schools. They said it flat out violated the Establishment Clause because it looked like the government was endorsing religion.
So knowing this precedent already existed, Louisiana still went ahead. Why do you think they did that? Were they hoping for a different outcome this time around?
It's certainly a head-scratcher, isn't it? Louisiana lawmakers must have known they were stepping onto legally shaky ground. It seems they believed the current judicial landscape might be more receptive to their arguments. Or perhaps they saw this as a battle worth fighting to make a point.
A battle that landed them in front of federal judge John W. DeGravels. What was the outcome there?
He issued a preliminary injunction, essentially hitting the pause button on this law, saying it's likely unconstitutional, citing both the Establishment and free exercise clauses.
So for now, no Ten Commandments on classroom walls. But I imagine this isn't the end of the story. This feels like just the opening act.
Oh, definitely. And this is where things get interesting. Louisiana could very well appeal this decision, sending it up the judicial ladder, possibly all the way to the Supreme Court. And if that happens, the implications could be massive.
Okay, hold up. Before we get into that, let's rewind to the judge's ruling. What were the core arguments that convinced him to block the law? What did the parents who brought the lawsuit find so problematic?
Their main point was that this law went against the very essence of what public schools should be. Neutral spaces where students from all backgrounds feel welcomed and respected, regardless of their religious beliefs. They argued that by mandating a specifically Judeo-Christian text, the government was sending a clear message that those beliefs were favored, potentially making kids who didn't share those beliefs feel like outsiders.
Right, so it's less about the Ten Commandments themselves and more about the act of the state making them mandatory in a public school setting. Because even though they're presented as a moral code, they're undeniably linked to specific religions.
Exactly. It creates a tricky situation where the government is seemingly blurring the lines between secular education and religious endorsement. And that raises a whole host of questions about individual rights and how we interpret the Constitution's guarantees of religious freedom.
And you mentioned the free exercise clause, too. How did the parents connect that to this law? Was it about feeling coerced into observing something they don't believe in?
That's a key part of it. Imagine you're a student or teacher who doesn't adhere to the tenets of the Ten Commandments. You're now required to be in a classroom where they're displayed daily. The plaintiffs argued that this constant exposure could feel like pressure to conform, or even like a subtle form of religious coercion, which goes against the principle of freely exercising or not exercising your own faith.
So even beyond the kids, teachers are caught in the middle of this, too.
Absolutely. This law put educators in a tremendously difficult spot. Imagine being a teacher who personally disagrees with the law, but could face consequences for not following it. That creates a real ethical and professional dilemma. For now, the injunction shields them from that pressure. But it's important to acknowledge the bind they were placed in.
It sounds like this case is less about the Ten Commandments themselves and more about this fundamental question. What role, if any, should religion play in our public schools, which are supposed to serve students of all faiths and none?
That's the heart of the matter, isn't it? And it's a question with no easy answers, as this case so clearly demonstrates. It really is a microcosm of a much larger debate happening nationwide. This tension between religious freedom and the separation of church and state isn't confined to Louisiana.
So this case is like the tip of the iceberg, you're saying?
Exactly. We're seeing similar clashes play out in school boards, courtrooms, and state legislatures all over the country. From prayer in schools to religious displays on public property to curriculum battles over how history and science are taught, these issues are popping up everywhere. It's clear there's a deep-seated societal divide on the role of religion in public life, especially when it comes to education.
It makes you wonder what's fueling this surge in these types of controversies.
I think part of it is tied to the shifting demographics of the U.S. As our nation becomes more religiously diverse, we're forced to confront questions we may have previously avoided. How do we accommodate different faiths, or those with no faith, in spaces that were traditionally assumed to have a Judeo-Christian foundation? It's forcing a reevaluation of long-held assumptions.
It feels like this Louisiana case is forcing everyone to pick a side, which never leads to productive conversations. And to our listeners, we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this case and the broader debate about religion in public schools? How do we balance individual rights with the need for inclusive learning environments? Share your thoughts on our social media channels. Let's keep this vital conversation going. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.